Hello, everyone. So today we are going to be talking more about primarily about modern Asia. Primarily, these are going to be talking about China, India, Japan, Korea, and some of Southeast Asia, so Thailand and the Philippines and such. So let's go ahead and let's start talking. I'm sorry, let me go turn on my light so that we can kind of see things a little better. Let's go ahead and let's talk about China to start off with. So, whenever we talk about China, we have to talk about it in the sense of it's a vast kingdom. Kingdom is the pattern of politics in China hasn't ever really been anything involving democracy. Usually, the power of the government rested in the hands of an elite few for China. The Chinese people have made many different advances in technology and scholarship, and these were often sought out by other countries who wanted those types of advancements for themselves. So, to start off with, ancient China was ruled initially by a series of dynasties. There were several dynasties, and we won't be getting into all of those dynasties today, but the most prominent dynasties were the Han Dynasty, the Tang Dynasty, which ruled from 1618 to 907, and the Song Dynasty, which ruled from 960 to 1279 AD. During the Tang Dynasty, we had Chinese influence extending to the borders of India and Persia, and into Korea, Japan, and Southeast Asia. The Song leadership was special, though, because it was the one that created a unified city-state centuries before other similar nation-states were common in Europe. This was helped because of the fact that China had, like, the Chinese Empire had a literate and well-trained civil service. Access to government jobs was very limited. Only children from wealthy families could really afford the education required to study for the civil service examinations required to be a part of the civil service, and it was a very well-respected position. There were several important inventions that happened during the Tang and Song periods. Printing began by Buddhist monks. The magnetic compass, maps, gunpowder, and different water wheels were just some of the prominent inventions. Now, all of this was fine up until the 12th century, whenever Mongol invaders led by Genghis Khan began to attack China. These Mongols captured Beijing in 1215, and the grandson of Genghis Khan, which was Kublai Khan, completed the Mongol conquest of China. The Mongol Empire ended up spreading from the Pacific Ocean to the Danube River in Europe. A system of roads enabled the Mongol people to establish regular contact with the Arabs, Russians, and Europeans. Now, poor leadership led to a fading of this dynasty and a weakening of this dynasty. And by about 1368, the Mongol rule had stopped and the Ming Dynasty began. The Ming Dynasty began in 1368 and ruled until 1644. And part of the main goal of the Ming Dynasty was to restore Chinese culture and to build trading ships. Ships to travel to India, Arabia, and East Africa. Around 1433, though, this traveling ceased for unknown reasons, and this dynasty ended up being the one that limited contact to outsiders. Outsiders for reasons that are still unclear to this day. Despite this, China continued to be a prized country for aggression. Russian. During this point in time, we also had invaders from Manchuria seizing control in 1644. They established a capital at Beijing and ruled until 1911. Foreign trade under the Manchurian people was encouraged, but under strict guidelines. By the 1800s, we saw internal problems leading to external pressures on China. The country's rapidly growing population put pressure on food supplies, and famines were becoming very frequent. The combination of this and corrupt leaders, along with a pressure from European nations to relax trade restrictions, led to much pressure on the rulers that were present at this point in time. However, they found an in. Europe did. Europe's opening in this point was a growing opium market. British merchants began selling opium from India and Turkey to the Chinese in the late 18th century. This made some Chinese merchants very wealthy, but the Manchurian leadership were very concerned about the growth of this harmful practice and created an opium war between Britain and China. Britain defeated China in this opium war after the destruction of millions of dollars of opium. And because of both of these, China's trade borders were reopened with looser trade restrictions as part of the agreements after the Opium War. British subjects at this point in time were also subject to British law, not Chinese law. The Chinese had little control over what British people did at this point in time. Now, some other European nations demanded similar treaties in what were called unequal treaties. And after centuries of influence flowing out of China and into Europe, the pathways of influence began to influence each other pretty much. China was influencing Europe and other countries around it, and those other countries were beginning to influence Chinese thinking. After an 1850 peasant uprising in China known as the Taiping Rebellion, sought to restore Chinese traditions, Britain began to get a deeper foothold because they helped the weak Manchurian leaders to quell that rebellion. And that was a way for other foreign countries to begin to dominate China throughout the 19th century. And each of these countries began to create little spheres of influence throughout China. Now, in the 20th century, some Chinese people began to undertake movements to restore Chinese power and culture. These people became known as Boxers. Their goal was to rid China of both the Manchu dynasty and the foreign traders and diplomats. Now, in 1900, they ended up laid siege to a compound in Beijing that housed foreign representatives, and a coalition of forces from foreign countries defeated the Boxers and demanded the Chinese government the right to maintain a military presence on Chinese soil. Because of this led to people feeling as though they were prisoners within their own country. Revolutionaries overthrew that Manchu dynasty in 1911 and proclaimed a republic. This republic ushered in a period of turmoil and conflict within China. But a leading figure emerged in the revolutionary movement, this nationalist movement, and his name was Dr. Sun Yat-sen, who had organized early uprisings against the Manchu, but who was living outside of China when the 1911 revolts took place. He returned to China and was named president of the Chinese Republic. He was only president for a month before he was removed by an army general, but he continued to exert influence into the country even after this. Sun helped to establish a base of operations in what's known as Canton. He helped to found the Kuomintang, or the Nationalist Party. Sun realized that he would need an army to help influence and control China after this after this with the Republic. So he began to organize and designated the Chiang Kai-shek to organize and lead the Kuomintang forces. Even after his death in 1925, the Chiang Kai-shek continued to lead forces on a march north from Canton, and by 1928, the Kuomintang had established firm control over the Chinese Republic. However, this was not as simple, because the Nationalist Party now had to contend with the growing Communist Party as of the 1920s. The Communists had organized in 1921 and had joined the Kuomintang in the hopes of gaining control of the party. Chiang Kai-shek realized the hidden agenda and expelled these people in 1927. Now the leader of the Communists, Mao Zedong, organized his forces in remote southeast China, and the two opposing parties battled in a civil war until 1934, when the Nationalist Party gained the upper hand. Then about 90,000 communist soldiers began what was known as the Long March into the far northwest to reorganize. This civil war was paused during World War II in order to concentrate on the Japanese invaders who began to invade the land. The United States gave assistance to the Nationalist Party and to Chiang, but Mao continued to build his army and to gain support amongst the people themselves. By 1945, Mao controlled the north of China and Chiang controlled the south. And the Civil War broke out again in 1945, and because they had the support of the people, the Communist Party was able to gain the upper hand. By 1949, the Nationalist Party had been effectively defeated, and this led to Mao Zedong declaring the People's Republic of China in 1949. They worked with the Soviet Union in Russia until Mao began criticizing changes in the USSR after Stalin's death, so around 1953. And this led to very much a cooling of diplomatic relations between China and the Soviet Union. Now, it's important to note that when the United Nations was founded, the UN recognized the nationalist government as the legitimate government of China at this point in time. China received a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, but after the communist takeover of China, which that nationalist party ended up moving to Taiwan, the nationalist government based in Taiwan continued to control that seat. But by 1971, this seat was given to the People's Republic of China after a vote. This move was supported by the other permanent members of the Security Council on the UN, except for the United States. Now, the relationship between China and the US was very tense until Richard Nixon, the president at that point in time, visited in 1972, which helped to ease relations between these two countries and potentially began to encourage steps towards capitalism in this country. Now let's go ahead and let's talk about India. So India during the Gupta Empire in the 1st centuries AD, the Hindu faith began spreading throughout India. However, India itself had a lack of a leader that led to many attacks and takeovers, and the first group that began to take over India was the Islamic Turks and the Afghans that began to invade and conquer in the 10th century. They were motivated primarily wanting to spread Muslim beliefs and acquire wealth from the land and its people. By 1398, the Mongols had begun to invade India, showing no mercy to the inhabitants. This Mongol invasion was led by a man named Tamerlane. They completely wiped out the city of Delhi and killing and enslaving the entire population of the city. The only exceptions really were the artisans, who were sent to build Tamerlane's new capital in what's now known as Uzbekistan. They didn't stay in India long, though. They moved towards other conquests, and they were able to things were kind of able to stabilize a little bit in India. However, these conquests led to the presence of and tension between followers of Islam and the Hindu people. The followers of Islam were not allowing their religion to be absorbed into Hinduism, and the Hindu people also, while they were tolerant, had many differences between Islam and Hinduism. Therefore, there was much tension between these two groups. Another Mongol invasion that was led by a man named Babur descended upon India in 1526. This was a Mongol invasion, but it ended up being called the Persian word for Mongol, Mughal, and this led to the Mughal dynasty that lasted for 300 years in India. And during this period, while they were Islamic, the rulers at this point in time, they did promote toleration of Hinduism. They built elaborate palaces and very manicured gardens. The Mughal Jahan had a tomb built for his wife in 1632 that ended up being known as the Taj Mahal, also at this point in time. During the Mughal ascendancy, traders from Europe began to arrive in India. Portugal opened a trade route, and other nations soon followed. By 1600, British merchants formed the East India Trading Company to begin to promote trade between Britain and India. By the 1800s, after the ousting of the French, the British ruled India as a colony. This is especially after the 7 Years' War had erupted in Europe around 1756. Now, this integration between Britain and India led to both technological and medical advances, better healthcare, improved travel, communication, all these benefits. Upper-class Indian children attended British-run schools and began to become a new professional class in the country. However, there was issues. The British policy of imposing their culture had harmful effects, and Britain sought to exploit India a bit by extracting raw materials for use in manufacturing activities and using it as a market for finished British goods, which led to issues where Indian artisans couldn't compete with the lower-cost British goods. Indian farmers were also encouraged to grow cotton over other foods, which occasionally led to famines. Now, there was indigenous opposition that began to strengthen the longer Britain ruled India, culminating in the formation of the National Congress Party in 1885. The goal of the Congress Party was merely home rule within the British Empire at first, but later the party advocated for complete independence. And one of the main influencers for this point in time was a man named Mahatma Gandhi. He was an attorney who had been educated in Britain and had earlier worked for greater civil rights for Indians in South Africa. Gandhi's approach to the issue was to adopt an attitude of non-violent resistance. He urged boycotting of British businesses and encouraged a renewal of cottage industries. And the people very much listened to him. He was a very respected leader at this point in time, giving him the title of Mahatma, or Great Soul. Now, by the end of World War II, Britain realized that they couldn't keep a hold of India as a colony, and in a meeting between the leaders, India was partitioned into a Hindu state and a Muslim state. This led to the creation of India as a Hindu state and Pakistan as a Muslim state. Now, this happened in August of 1947, and the political boundaries didn't affect where all Muslim and Hindu people lived. As a result, millions of people began to move. Muslims in India moved to Pakistan, and Hindus in Pakistan moved to India. India in the 1950s and 1960s was marked primarily by the growth of industry once everyone had settled down in their new places. It was marked by the growth of industry, the modernization of agriculture, and a greater sense of unity. But the booming population led to a strain on the nation's resources. Opposition of leadership to the Congress Party sometimes became violent, and a major issue was an uprising of Sikh separatists. However, Pakistan also had its own issues. It originally started as a democracy, but ended up leading to civil and political unrest due to tensions in trying to merge parts of Pakistan. East and West Pakistan ended up separating out into separate areas, with many in East Pakistan demanding self-rule due to flooding and slow response by the national government. East Pakistanis won a majority of seats in the democracy in December 1970 election, but the military dictator threw out the results with a civil war erupting that same year. By 1971, East Pakistan became officially the independent country of Bangladesh. So let's go ahead and let's talk a little bit about Japan, Korea, and Southeast Asia. We've talked a bit about Japan. Let's go ahead and talk about Japan's history. So Japan during the 3rd century AD had rulers from the Yamato Plain on Japan's largest island begin to lead a central government for the entire country. They claimed that they were descendants of the sun goddess, who ranked first amongst the Shinto deities. And this led to emperors and shoguns ruling Japan. By 1180, the Minamoto family revolted against the ruling dynasty and established the first military government, with emperors no longer being leader and shoguns filling that role. The shogun system resisted 2 Mongol invasions in the 13th century, actually. Fighting and feuding amongst rival families continued, but after a while, the shogun was effectively removed as a position. Now, Japan, after a period of military and shogun rule, was reunified in the late 1500s. However, it still kept its closed borders after meetings with European traders. Pretty much all European countries except for the Dutch were excluded from the country. After this point in time, after this reunification, from the early 1600s until 1868, the Tokugawa dynasty ruled Japan from their castle in the castle town of Edo, which is modern Tokyo. This isolationist policy that began in 1639 cut Japan off from almost all contact with the outside world, and this stayed the same until 1854, when U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry arrived leading an American fleet of ships. He demanded that Japan open its ports to foreign trade, and the Tokugawa regime signed agreements with the U.S. and other foreign nations to allow their borders to be more open. Because of this, Japan was very quickly transformed into a very industrialized world power. Japan did it their own way instead of having it forced upon them more as a colony of a foreign power. It was their own choice to really take in these foreign ideas and to integrate them into their own. By 1889, a constitutional government was put into place. And after the 1894-1895 war against China, Japan emerged as a world superpower. Japan was one of the allies in World War I, seizing German territories in Asia and gaining control of Korea. 10 years later, Japan defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War and added the Sakhalin Islands and other territories to its empire growing more and more. Now, after World War II, Japan saw devastation with the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs. After Japan's defeat, the United States forced acceptance of a revised constitution, and this revised constitution led to a parliamentary system being put in place as terms of their defeat. While Japan did prosper economically after the war with many Japanese companies began to come into existence at this point in time, manufacturing automobiles, motorcycles that became international brands, Japan did suffer an economic decline that took place in the 1990s. This was resolved in the 2000s until 2011, when a major earthquake led to a nuclear meltdown in Fukushima, causing a major setback for the people of Japan. The largest nuclear disaster since the 1986 disaster at the Chernobyl plant in Ukraine. Let's talk about Korea. The people of Korea started in small kingdoms and city-states, primarily due to Korea being a very mountainous country. Until the establishment of Koryo, the original name of Korea, with the Joseon dynasty becoming the major rulers. This dynasty ruled from 1392 until 1910. Now, Koreans fought against many invasions over this long period, usually by the Chinese people or the Mongol people. The country resisted opening up its ports until the 1800s to Western traders. Around 1900, Japan, China, and Russia all wanted to expand their territory, and all of them targeted Korea. I apologize. Japan annexed Korea in 1910 and ruled with a firm hand until the end of World War II, using it to ship many raw materials from Korea back to Japan, and required that the Japanese language be used in schools and newspapers. Now, after World War II, Japan was forced to step back from Korea, and the U.S. allowed the Soviet Union to take over part of North Korea, leading to that portion becoming communist. With the end of the Korean War and a division fully being set between North Korea and South Korea, the two parts formed very differently. South Korea, after much struggle with military dictators, became a modern democratic republic with an economy that experienced a level of prosperity. North Korea, on the other hand, has endured a harsh government control of the economy and society. Now, North and South Korea never signed a peace treaty to end the Korean War, and tensions on the peninsula, even though there is a division in place, remain high. There is a so-called demilitarized zone between the two countries, and is one of the most heavily fortified borders in the world. But the two sides are beginning to take more open steps towards communication, so we'll have to watch and see where that develops. Now let's talk about a bit of Southeast Asia. The region of Southeast Asia includes the area south of China, the east of Bangladesh, as well as the Philippines, Indonesia, and other Pacific islands. We're only going to talk a little bit about each of these, so let's go ahead and talk a little bit about each of these and get into their history as mentioned. Now, the spice trade in the 1500s opened up Southeast Asia to Europe. Spain conquered the Philippine Islands in 1571 as a bridge between the Spice Islands and Spanish-American colonies. Otherwise, European countries only operated trading posts in the regions and didn't pursue colonization at this point in time. Now, by the 1700s, Europe began to create plantations in Southeast Asia for things that were more difficult to grow in Europe. These are things like coffee, sugar, rice, these kinds of things. The Industrial Revolution also made Southeast Asia raw materials very appealing, such as oil, rubber, and tin. and these were all very attractive to European nations. Now, whenever we talk about each of the countries, we're just going to talk a little bit about each of these. Now, Siam, now called Thailand, was the only Southeast Asian country that was not colonized by a European power. During the 1800s, Thailand rulers modernized the country and welcomed European trade. This country was seen as a neutral buffer between the British in Burma and the French in Indochina. Now, in the Philippines, there was a nationalist movement that began in the Philippines in the late 1800s, and these fighters helped the U.S. during the Spanish-American War. However, when independence wasn't granted to them after the war, the nationalists turned on the Americans and began to fight them. Independence was only granted to the Philippines after World War II in 1946. Malaysia was founded in 2 sections and gained independence in 1963. Singapore was briefly part of Malaysia, and it was founded primarily as a trading outpost in 1819. It was briefly part of a federation of Malaysia, but it became independent in 1965. Singapore is one of the smallest countries in the world and one of the most densely populated. The last country we're going to really talk about is Indonesia. Indonesia is a former Dutch colony that gained independence in 1949. Indonesia is the 4th most populous country in the world and the country with the largest Muslim population. However, with that is all we have to talk about this week for talking about the European countries. Please be sure to fill out and submit your study guide and quiz to ThinkWave, and I will see you guys next week. Have a good rest of your